Right now, your head might be heavy, your body might be tired, and somewhere in the back of your mind, there is a dull, familiar ache that has been sitting there all day, the kind that makes the light feel too bright and the sounds feel too sharp and the pillow feel like the only honest friend you have. And here is what I want you to know before we go any further. People have been feeling exactly this way for 5,000 years. Long before aspirin existed, long before thermometers were invented, long before any doctor had ever heard the word ibuprofen, the ancient Egyptians were lying down with headaches and fevers and asking the same question you are asking right now, which is, what do I do about this and when will it stop? And the answer they found, the answer that a civilization of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary care worked out over thousands of years along the banks of the greatest river the ancient world had ever known, is one of the most quietly fascinating stories in all of human history. So here is all I am asking you to do tonight. Just keep listening. Do not try to sleep yet. Do not try to fix anything. Just let these words come to you in the dark, and let the story of the ancient Egyptians and their headaches and their fevers and their remarkable, tender, ingenious approach to the suffering body carry you slowly, gently, all the way to rest. We are going back 5,000 years tonight. We are going to the banks of the Nile, and we are going to take our time. The civilization of ancient Egypt endured for roughly 3,000 years of continuous recorded history, which is a span of time so enormous that it is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. When Cleopatra, whom most of us think of as belonging to ancient Egypt, was alive, the great pyramids of Giza were already older to her than the Roman Colosseum is to us today. The Old Kingdom, which built those pyramids, was separated from Cleopatra's Ptolemaic period by roughly the same stretch of time that separates us from ancient Babylon. Egypt was not a single moment in time. It was a river in every sense of the word, flowing from the earliest pre-dynastic settlements along the Nile through the Old Kingdom and its pyramid builders, through the Middle Kingdom and its literary flowering, through the New Kingdom and its empire builders, through the late period and its Persian and Greek rulers, and finally into the Roman period that absorbed it. And throughout all of those centuries, throughout all of those dynasties and pharaohs and periods of glory and periods of decline, the Egyptian people got headaches, they ran fevers, their children burned in the night with mysterious illnesses, their laborers came home from the fields with pounding temples and swollen eyes. Their priests arose from their prayers with the dull ache behind the eyes that we recognize instantly as the headache of stress and strain, and they dealt with it. They dealt with it in ways that were sophisticated, systematic, and in many cases remarkably effective, combining what we would today call medicine, religion, magic, and pharmacy into a single integrated approach to healing that was as complete in its own way as anything in the modern world. To understand how the ancient Egyptians dealt with headaches and fevers, you first have to understand how they understood the human body. And their understanding was both different from ours and in certain crucial respects, surprisingly close to it. The Egyptians did not have a germ theory of disease. They did not know about bacteria or viruses or inflammatory cytokines, but they had something that served some of the same functions, a detailed, carefully observed, systematically recorded understanding of what happened when the body went wrong, and an extensive practical knowledge of what various interventions did to that wrongness. They were empiricists in the truest sense, people who paid close attention to what they saw and noted what worked and what did not. The primary medical texts that survive from ancient Egypt and that give us our most detailed knowledge of Egyptian medical practice are extraordinary documents. The Ebers Papyrus, discovered in Luxor in 1873 and dating to approximately 1550 before the Common Era, but believed to be a copy of texts considerably older, is one of the longest and most comprehensive medical texts to survive from the ancient world. It is a scroll of papyrus roughly 20 meters in length, covered in the neat hieratic script of an Egyptian scribe, and it contains hundreds of medical prescriptions, diagnostic observations, and treatment protocols covering an enormous range of conditions from eye diseases to intestinal complaints to skin conditions to what are clearly described as headache and fever. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, slightly earlier and more surgically focused, deals primarily with traumatic injuries and is remarkable for its purely rational, observation-based approach, describing cases, examinations, diagnoses, and treatments without any reference to supernatural causes in its medical sections, which was unusual for the ancient world. The Kahun Papyrus deals with gynecological conditions. The Hearst Papyrus and the Berlin Papyrus contain further medical prescriptions. Together, these texts and the smaller fragments that supplement them give us a remarkably detailed picture of Egyptian medical knowledge over a period of more than 1,000 years. What these texts reveal about the Egyptian understanding of headache is particularly interesting. The Egyptians recognized headache as a distinct and important clinical entity, which means they paid enough attention to it to give it its own vocabulary and its own diagnostic and treatment categories. The Egyptian word for head, TP, appears repeatedly in medical contexts, combined with words for pain, heaviness, aching, and what appears to be a distinction between different qualities of head pain that is remarkably similar to the distinctions modern headache specialists make between migraine, tension headache, and cluster headache. Texts describe the headache that comes with fever as distinct from the headache that comes with eye strain, or from the headache that follows too much sun, or from the headache that the texts describe as arising from demons, which is the category that modern scholars believe covered what we would call migraines, with their characteristic visual disturbances, their one-sided severe pain, their nausea, and their mysterious spontaneous onset that had no obvious external cause and therefore seemed, to the ancient observer, to require an explanation beyond the purely physical. This is a crucial point about Egyptian medicine that deserves to be understood carefully. The Egyptians did not divide the world into the natural and the supernatural in the way that post-Enlightenment Western thought does. For them, the world was a single integrated whole in which divine forces, demonic forces, natural forces, and human forces all operated simultaneously and in relationship with each other. When a person developed a severe migraine with visual aura, the sudden onset, the strange visual phenomena, the incapacitating pain, the vomiting, could reasonably be attributed to the presence of a hostile supernatural entity, because in the Egyptian worldview, hostile supernatural entities were real and active in the world. This did not mean that physical remedies were useless. It meant that the most effective treatment combined physical remedies with the additional power of ritual and magical text, because the most complete treatment addressed all the possible causes at once. This integrated approach was not primitive. It was, within its own cosmological framework, rigorously logical. The physician in ancient Egypt was called the SWNW, a word that translates most directly as physician and that referred to a medical professional with formal training, access to the medical texts, and the ability to diagnose and prescribe. The SWNW was distinct from the Sao, a kind of magical healer who worked primarily through spells and amulets, and from the Wab priest of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and destruction, who conducted specifically religious healing ceremonies. But in practice, these categories overlapped considerably, and many healers combined elements of all three traditions. The most complete healing approach, the one that Egyptian medical culture at its most sophisticated brought to a case of severe headache or high fever, was an integrated package that included physical examination, prescription of compound medicines, application of topical preparations, recitation of spells, wearing of protective amulets, and consultation of the relevant divine powers. Let us imagine we are in a house in the ancient city of Thebes, which the Egyptians called Waset during the New Kingdom period, approximately the 14th century before the Common Era. At the height of Egypt's imperial glory, the Nile is close. It is always close in Thebes, in the way that the river is the central fact of Egyptian life, the source of everything that makes the valley habitable, the annual flood that deposits the black silt that gives the farmland its extraordinary fertility, the highway along which goods and people move, the divine artery whose health is the health of Egypt itself. In summer, which is when our story takes place, the heat along the Nile is considerable. The sun of Upper Egypt is not the gentle Mediterranean sun of a Greek summer. It is a direct, heavy, almost physical presence that presses down from a sky so intensely blue it looks almost ceramic, and that reflects back up from the pale limestone and the white-plastered walls of the houses in a double heat that can be genuinely dangerous. In this house, a woman named Nefertari, which means the most beautiful companion, and was a name common enough in New Kingdom Egypt to have been borne by at least 2 queens and innumerable ordinary women, is lying in a darkened room with a wet cloth on her forehead and the particular stillness of someone whose head hurts too much to move. She is the wife of a scribe who works in the administrative offices of the temple complex, a man of middling rank and decent income, and their house reflects this. Not large, not grand, but solid, made of mud brick that keeps the interior cool relative to the searing day outside, with a flat roof where the family sleeps in summer to catch whatever breeze comes off the river, and an interior room on the ground floor where the heat is least, and where Nefertari has retreated because the light and the sound of the household are too much for her head today. Her headache began this morning, which is not the first time this particular kind has come. She recognizes it. It began with a strange visual disturbance, a shimmer at the edge of her sight that moved slowly inward, a kind of crescent of flickering light that the Egyptian medical texts, had she the scholarly vocabulary to match her experience to the written word, would have recognized as what we now call a migraine aura. After perhaps 20 minutes of this visual phenomenon, the pain arrived, on the left side of her head, behind and above her eye, with the specific pulsing quality of vascular headache, worsening with any movement, accompanied by a strong sensitivity to light and a stomach that is unhappy without being fully sick. She has sent a child to fetch her neighbor, an older woman named Hinut, who has dealt with this kind of headache before and who knows what to do. Hinut arrives with a basket. This is the first and most important thing to know about ancient Egyptian headache treatment. It was comprehensive, layered, and often involved several different approaches simultaneously. Hinut is not a formal physician, but she has the knowledge that women in traditional communities have always accumulated and transmitted. The knowledge of herbs and preparations, of techniques passed from mother to daughter, of what the physician or the healer priest has prescribed before for this condition, and how to replicate the most accessible parts of that prescription. She is, in the living tradition of Egyptian healing, one of its most important carriers, because formal medical training in ancient Egypt was the province of a relatively small number of specialists, while the day-to-day management of headache and fever and the common ailments of ordinary life was carried by women like Hinut in their practical knowledge and their baskets of herbs. Hinut's basket contains several things. There is willow bark, stripped in thin pieces from the branches of the Nile-side willows that grew along the banks of the river. The willow was used in Egyptian medicine as documented in the Ebers Papyrus, and this is one of the most remarkable coincidences, or rather, one of the most remarkable pieces of empirical validation in the history of medicine. Willow bark contains salicin, which the human body metabolizes into salicylic acid, which is the active compound from which aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid, is derived. The ancient Egyptians did not know this. They did not know what salicin was. They had no concept of active chemical compounds or of the cascade of biochemical events by which salicin becomes salicylic acid, and salicylic acid inhibits the production of prostaglandins, which reduces pain and inflammation and fever. But they observed, empirically, over generations of use, that preparations made from willow bark reduced pain and reduced fever, and they recorded this observation in their medical texts and used the preparation accordingly. This is one of those moments in the history of medicine that is genuinely humbling, that people 5,000 years ago were treating headache and fever with the same active compound that is in the white tablet you might take tonight, discovered not through chemistry or pharmacology, but through the patient, careful watching of what helped and what did not. Hinut prepares the willow bark by crumbling the dried pieces into a small ceramic vessel with warm water that has been sitting in the sun, which will have brought it to a temperature good for steeping the bark without boiling it, and she sets this aside to steep while she attends to the other parts of the treatment. She brings out a piece of fresh aloe, the succulent plant whose gel has been used in Egyptian medicine for cooling and soothing since at least the 16th century before the Common Era, as documented in the Ebers Papyrus and in the somewhat later medical texts from the tomb of Amenhotep. The aloe gel is applied to the forehead and the temples with gentle strokes of the fingers, and it has an immediate cooling sensation on the skin that is not merely psychological. Aloe vera gel actually does reduce skin temperature through evaporative cooling, and the Egyptians used it for burns and inflammatory conditions with the same practical empiricism they brought to everything else. She takes from the basket a small linen pouch that has been filled with dried lotus flower petals and a little coriander seed and what appears to be dried chamomile, and she places this pouch on Nefertari's forehead over the aloe gel, covering it lightly with the edge of the linen cloth already there. The weight of the pouch is slight but perceptible, and the warmth of the herbs inside, warmed by the skin, releases a faint aroma that is slightly sweet and herbal and somehow makes the air in the darkened room smell less like the headache and more like something gentle and deliberate. Nefertari lies still. Hinut sits beside her on a low stool and says very little, because one of the things she knows from experience is that the person with the headache does not want conversation. They want presence. They want someone there in the darkened room with them, doing the quiet, purposeful things that help, and not requiring them to speak or respond or perform functionality they do not currently possess. The Egyptian medical texts describe numerous compound remedies for head pain, and they are worth exploring in some detail because they reveal both the sophistication of Egyptian pharmacological knowledge and the intriguing overlap between what they prescribed and what modern research on botanical medicine would confirm as genuinely active. The Ebers Papyrus lists a remedy for headache that combines several plants including coriander, which contains compounds that have genuine anti-inflammatory properties, juniper berries, which were widely used in ancient medicine across the Near East, and which contain volatile oils with analgesic properties, a plant called juniper cedar or wormwood in some translations, which contains artemisia and other compounds with pharmacological activity. Honey, which was ubiquitous in Egyptian medicine, and which is both a genuine antimicrobial and a vehicle that helps carry other compounds and makes them more palatably administered. And various oils, particularly castor oil and a plant oil called moringa oil, pressed from the seeds of the moringa tree that grew in the Nile Valley, and that is now being extensively studied by modern researchers who have confirmed its significant anti-inflammatory properties. The remedies are delivered in various ways in the Egyptian texts. Some are drinks, prepared by steeping or boiling plant materials in water or in beer, because beer in ancient Egypt was not the recreational drink it is primarily considered today, but was a staple food and medicine vehicle of major importance. Egyptian beer was made from partially baked barley bread and was thick nutritious, low in alcohol relative to modern beer, and full of B vitamins from the fermentation process that made it genuinely healthful as a source of nutrition in a diet that was otherwise grain, vegetables, and occasional fish or meat, when medical texts prescribed medicines in beer. This was partly because the slight alcohol helped extract compounds from plant materials, and partly because the beer itself provided nutrition to an ill person who might not be able to eat, and partly because the familiar, comforting, slightly sour and malty flavor of beer made the medicine more acceptable when other preparations might taste extremely unpleasant. Nefertari drinks the willow bark preparation that Hinut has steeped, which tastes bitter and slightly astringent in the way that willow bark always does, and she grimaces slightly at the taste, but drinks it because she trusts the preparation and because this is not the first headache Hinut has helped her through. The grimace of the bitter medicine is itself an almost unbrokenly continuous gesture across 5,000 years of human medicine, the slight tightening of the face at something that helps you but does not taste like it intends to. While Nefertari rests, let us step back from her immediate situation and look at the broader landscape of Egyptian medical practice, because the headache is only one part of the story and the fever is a separate and in many ways more serious chapter. Fever in the ancient world was both more dangerous and more mysterious than headache. A headache, however severe, was generally non-lethal. Fever could kill, and it did, regularly and sometimes very rapidly. In a world before antibiotics, before intravenous fluids, before the ability to support the body through severe infection while the immune system did its work, a high fever was a genuine and immediate threat to life, and the Egyptian physicians and healers who dealt with it were dealing with something that required their best thinking. The Egyptian understanding of fever was that it represented a fundamental disruption of the body's proper state, which they described in terms of heat and movement and the proper flow of bodily substances through a network of channels they called the metu. The metu were conceptually similar to the blood vessels and also to something more than blood vessels, channels through which not only blood, but air, water, semen, tears, urine, and other bodily substances were believed to flow. The heart was understood as the central pump and governor of this system, which is remarkably close to the modern understanding in structural terms, though the Egyptian understanding of what was flowing through the system was different from ours. When the metu were blocked, or when they carried the wrong substances in the wrong directions, illness resulted. Fever was associated with an excess of heat in the metu, and with the presence of what the texts call WHDW, a substance produced in the intestines whose excessive movement through the metu caused pain, inflammation, and fever. This concept of WHDW is one of the most interesting things in ancient Egyptian medicine because it represents an attempt to explain the connection between intestinal health and systemic illness that modern medicine has only recently begun to understand in detail. The gut-brain axis, the microbiome-immune system relationship, the role of intestinal permeability in systemic inflammation. These are cutting-edge research topics in modern medicine. The ancient Egyptians did not understand any of this at the molecular level, but they observed that people with intestinal problems were more likely to develop fevers, that purging the intestines sometimes relieved fever, and that the health of the gut was connected to the health of the whole body in ways that were not obvious but were real. They built this observation into their theoretical framework, and while the theory was wrong in its specific mechanisms, it pointed toward a genuine connection that took modern medicine most of the 20th century to begin to take seriously. The treatment of fever in ancient Egyptian medicine was accordingly multi-pronged. It addressed the physical heat through cooling preparations applied to the body. It addressed the presumed intestinal source through preparations designed to purge or cleanse the digestive system. It addressed the divine or demonic aspect through protective spells and amulets and prayers to the appropriate gods. And it addressed the nutritional needs of the feverish body through carefully prescribed foods and drinks that would not overtax the digestive system while providing the fluids and nutrients the fever-depleted body needed. The cooling preparations for fever were applied externally to the body, particularly to the head, the neck, the wrists, and the inner surfaces of the elbows and knees, which Egyptian healers observed correctly were the places where cooling the body was most effective, because these are the areas where blood vessels lie close to the skin, and cooling them has the most rapid effect on core body temperature. The preparations used included water in which cooling herbs had been steeped, specifically plants the Egyptians described as cooling in their nature, including cucumber extract, which does have a genuinely cooling effect both through evaporation and through the cucumber's actual water content, and the extract of the blue water lily, the sacred lotus of Egypt, which appears repeatedly in Egyptian medical texts for multiple conditions, and which contains compounds including nuciferine and aporphine that have genuine pharmacological activity as antispasmodic and calming agents. The blue water lily, Nymphaea caerulea, deserves extended discussion because it is one of the most pervasive and significant plants in ancient Egyptian medical and spiritual culture, and its role in the treatment of headache and fever illuminates the way the Egyptians made no separation between medicine and spirituality. The blue lotus was associated with the sun god Ra and with the creation myth in which the first sunrise emerged from a blue lotus blossom floating on the primordial waters of Nun. It was therefore a plant of the highest divine significance, associated with the source of all light and life. It appeared in offerings, in funerary contexts, in religious art, in garlands worn at festival banquets. And it also appeared in medicine, prepared as a tea, as an oil infusion, as an additive to wine or beer. The compounds it contains have mild sedative and analgesic effects that would have been useful in managing the discomfort of fever and headache, and the association with Ra meant that using it was simultaneously a medical and a sacred act, placing the sick person under the protection of the most powerful of the divine forces at the same moment as providing genuine pharmacological relief. The fever drinks prescribed in the Ebers Papyrus include some remarkable formulations. One prescription for what appears to be high fever includes a combination of sycamore fig syrup, which is sweet and nutritious and provides energy to the fever-depleted body, honey, which, as we have noted, is both a genuine antimicrobial and an excellent vehicle for other medicines, the fruit of the dom palm, which contains vitamins and minerals, and an extract described as coming from a plant called the Egyptian wormwood, which is artemisia, the plant family that contains artemisinin, the compound that is today the basis of the most effective antimalarial drugs. This is extraordinary. Malaria was endemic in the Nile Delta and in the marshy areas along the river, and the fevers that malaria produced were a major health burden in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians were, apparently without knowing it in modern terms, treating malarial fever with a botanical preparation that contained the plant family responsible for the most powerful natural antimalarial compounds known. Again, this was not chemistry. It was empiricism, refined over generations of careful observation of what worked and what did not. The role of honey in Egyptian medicine is so significant that it deserves its own extended treatment, because it was the most universally prescribed substance in the entire Egyptian medical corpus. The Ebers Papyrus mentions honey in something like a third of all its prescriptions, used both internally as a drink additive and flavor carrier, and externally as a wound dressing, a skin treatment, and a base for ointments. The Egyptians kept bees in woven clay hives along the Nile and considered honey a gift of the gods, specifically associated with Ra. Modern research has confirmed that honey is not merely a pleasant food. It is a genuinely antimicrobial substance whose mechanism of action includes the production of hydrogen peroxide, its low water activity, which inhibits bacterial growth, and its content of B-defensin proteins that are genuinely antibiotic. Wounds dressed with honey in the ancient world healed better than unwashed wounds because the honey was actually killing the bacteria. Fevers treated with honey-based drinks received a medicinal input that had genuine physical effects beyond simple nutrition. Let us return to Nefertari and her darkened room. The willow bark preparation has been settling into her system for perhaps an hour, which is roughly the time required for salicin to be metabolized to salicylic acid and for the anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects to begin to manifest. The headache has not disappeared, but its edge has softened slightly, the way a severe pain sometimes does when the first intervention begins to work, becoming manageable rather than overwhelming. Hinut has been sitting quietly, occasionally refreshing the cooling cloth on Nefertari's forehead and replacing it with a cloth that has been dipped in the water in which blue lotus leaves have been steeping, so that the scent of the lotus rises from the cloth and the skin absorbs whatever compounds are soluble in the cool water. Now Hinut does something that a purely modern medical perspective would classify differently from the herbal preparations, but that in Egyptian medical culture was understood as an equally essential part of the treatment. She recites a spell. The spells in the Egyptian medical papyri are not separate from the medical prescriptions. They appear within the same texts, sometimes integrated into a single treatment protocol, sometimes listed separately with directions for use alongside the physical prescription. The spell Hinut uses is a simplified version of a type well documented in the Ebers Papyrus, and addressed to the pain itself, invoking the authority of certain divine names to command the pain to leave the sufferer. The Egyptian belief that illness could be caused by the entry of a hostile entity or force into the body, and that this entity could be addressed and commanded to leave through the proper use of divine authority encoded in the correct words, was not separate from medical practice. It was part of it. The Egyptian word for this type of healing speech was Heka, which is also the name of the god of magic, and Heka was a fundamental force in the Egyptian cosmological understanding. It was not supernatural in the sense of being outside the natural order. It was a natural force, present in the cosmos from the beginning of creation, available to human beings who knew how to access and use it properly. The physician who prescribed the willow bark and the healer who recited the spell were both drawing on real forces in their understanding. The willow bark drew on the physical properties of the plant. The spell drew on Heka, the creative power of properly formed and properly spoken language. Neither was inferior to the other. Both were necessary for the most complete healing. Modern medicine has a complicated relationship with this kind of thinking. On one hand, we now know enough about the placebo effect and the mind-body relationship to understand that what a patient believes about their treatment has measurable physiological effects. A patient who believes they are receiving an effective treatment experiences a different neurological and immunological response than one who does not, even when the treatments are physically identical. The ritual of healing, the caring presence of the healer, the authoritative spoken word that assures the patient that the pain is being addressed and that they are protected, these have real effects that cannot be dismissed as merely psychological, because the division between psychological and physical in human healing is not as clean as we sometimes pretend. The ancient Egyptians did not understand this in the terms of modern neuroscience. But they had observed over thousands of years that healing that combined the physical and the spiritual was more effective than healing that used only one, and they built this observation into their practice with the same empirical rigor they brought to their botanical pharmacology. The divine powers most frequently invoked in the treatment of headache and fever were several, and understanding them gives us insight into how the Egyptians conceptualized illness and healing at the deepest level. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess whose name means the powerful one, was the goddess of both disease and healing. This dual nature was not contradictory in Egyptian thinking. The same force that could send illness was the force that understood it most deeply and could therefore heal it. The priests of Sekhmet were specialized healers, and their temples at Memphis and at Karnak served as healing sanctuaries where the sick came for treatment. The logic was elegant. If Sekhmet had sent the illness, approaching Sekhmet in the proper ritual way could convince her to withdraw it. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and medicine, was invoked in medical spells because he was the record keeper of divine knowledge and the source of the healing arts themselves. Egyptian tradition credited Thoth with the authorship of the medical texts, or at least with their divine inspiration, and invoking Thoth in a healing spell was invoking the source of medical knowledge itself. Isis, the great mother goddess, was among the most powerful of the healing divinities because of the mythological narrative in which she reassembled and restored the dismembered body of her husband Osiris, an act of healing that demonstrated her mastery over physical restoration. Her name was invoked repeatedly in fever treatment spells, asking her to cool the heat of the illness, as she had once cooled the wound of Horus when the young god had been strung by a scorpion in the marshes. The scorpion sting of Horus was, in fact, the mythological template that organized much of Egyptian fever treatment. The myth told that the infant Horus, hidden with his mother Isis in the papyrus marshes of the delta to protect him from his uncle Set, was strung by a scorpion and developed a burning fever that threatened his life. Isis called out to Ra in his solar bark passing overhead in the sky, and Ra stopped the bark and sent down Thoth to heal the child. The spells Thoth used to cure the fever of Horus were believed to be the same spells that would cure fever in any mortal child or adult, because what worked for a god worked for a person when properly invoked. This mythological frame gave the healer extraordinary authority. The words they spoke were not merely human words, but were the very words that had healed a divine child at the beginning of time. The patient lying with fever was placed within a mythological narrative in which they were Horus, the healing mother was Isis, and the healer was Thoth, and the power of that narrative to mobilize the patient's own healing capacities was not trivial. The question of fever in children deserves specific attention, because Egyptian medical texts do make distinctions between adult and child patients, particularly in dosing and in some of the specific preparations used, and because the fear of childhood fever was one of the most universal and pressing anxieties in Egyptian family life. The infant mortality rate in ancient Egypt, as in all pre-modern societies, was extremely high. Estimates suggest that somewhere between a quarter and a third of children died before the age of 5, and fever, whether from infection, malaria, or other causes, was one of the primary killers. The desperation of a parent watching a child burn with fever in the ancient world is something that requires no imagination to understand. It is immediate and human and utterly familiar, and the lengths to which Egyptian parents went to address it are a measure of both their love and their ingenuity. The Ebers Papyrus and other medical texts include specific pediatric preparations, including medicines for the fever of a newborn, which were to be administered by the mother before nursing, so that the medicine would pass through the breast milk to the infant, which is actually a reasonable delivery mechanism for some water-soluble compounds. They include formulations specifically described as appropriate for the small bodies of children, with reduced plant material concentrations. They include instructions for the application of cooling preparations to the child's body and head, and for the magical and ritual protections that were particularly important in child cases, because children were understood to be more vulnerable to the entry of hostile forces, lacking the spiritual defenses that adults developed over time. Amulets for febrile children are among the most numerous and most carefully made of all Egyptian protective objects, reflecting the intensity of the parental desire to protect and the belief that the right amulet in the right material worn at the right place on the body could tip the balance in a child's fight with fever. The amulets used in Egyptian healing were not decorations or mere symbols. They were understood as active participants in the healing process, objects whose material, shape, color, and the divine names inscribed on them gave them genuine power to protect and heal. The Djed pillar, symbol of stability and associated with Osiris, was used in healing amulets because it invoked the stabilizing force against the destabilization of illness. The Eye of Horus, the Wedget Eye, was one of the most powerful protective symbols in the entire Egyptian repertoire, associated with healing and wholeness, because the myth of Horus described his eye being restored after being damaged by Set, making it the symbol of healing from injury or illness. A Wedget Eye amulet worn by a feverish child was invoking the divine precedent of the eye's restoration, asking that the child's health be restored as the eye had been restored. The faience amulets found in Egyptian archaeological contexts, those blue-green glazed objects that fill the display cases of Egyptian collections in museums around the world, were not mass-produced trinkets. They were carefully made objects whose color was itself part of their power, the blue-green of faience being associated with life, renewal, and the fertile inundation of the Nile, the color of the water, and the color of the papyrus marsh that was the first shelter of the healing goddess Isis. The material of an amulet was as important as its shape. Gold held divine solar power. Red jasper had the power of blood and of the red land, the desert, and was used in some protective contexts. Lapis lazuli, imported at great expense from Afghanistan, carried the color of the night sky and the power of the celestial divine. Each material spoke its own language within the Egyptian symbolic system, and a skilled healer knew which materials to use for which conditions. Now the afternoon is deepening. In Nefertari's room, the worst of the headache has passed. She is not yet well, but the pulsing quality has reduced to a dull ache, and the light sensitivity has diminished enough that she can open her eyes without the stabbing pain of the morning. Hinut brings her something to eat, which is important because the fasting body of a headache sufferer is a headache-perpetuating body. The blood sugar drop that comes with not eating worsening the vascular instability that underlies migraine. And while the Egyptians did not describe this mechanism in those terms, they had observed that the headache sufferer who ate something light and nourishing in the middle of the attack often came through the other side faster than one who did not eat at all. The food is simple, a piece of flatbread made from emmer wheat, which was the primary grain of ancient Egypt, and a few dried figs, which are sweet and calorie-dense and easy for a reluctant stomach to accept, and a small cup of herbed water in which coriander seeds have been steeped, which settles the stomach with its mild carminative properties and also provides a little anti-inflammatory activity through the linalool and other volatile compounds in the coriander. The Egyptian diet in general was both a medicine and a potential cause of some headache conditions, and this interplay deserves attention. The staple diet of ordinary Egyptians was based on bread and beer, the two primary products of grain fermentation. Bread was baked in multiple varieties from emmer wheat and barley, some varieties leavened with wild fermentation cultures and some unleavened, and constituted the central caloric foundation of the Egyptian diet at every level of society. The wealthy ate more meat, more wine, more imported delicacies, but even they ate quantities of bread that would seem extraordinary to a modern Western person accustomed to thinking of carbohydrates as optional. The bread was dense and nutritious, but it was also, by the evidence of the mummy studies that have examined ancient Egyptian dental and skeletal remains, full of grit from the stone grinding mills and from the wind-blown sand of Egypt's desert environment, and this grit ground down Egyptian teeth over decades with a systematic thoroughness that left many elderly Egyptians with severely worn dentition. The dental problems that resulted were a significant source of chronic pain, including headache referred from jaw and tooth problems, and the medical texts include preparations for tooth pain that overlap considerably with those for headache. The Egyptian physician who treated headache was therefore often dealing with a condition that had multiple possible contributing causes. The referred pain of dental disease, the vascular disruption of migraine, the tension and strain of working in the sun at physical labor, the dehydration of the Egyptian summer that was a constant and serious factor along the Nile, the nutritional deficiencies that could result from an otherwise adequate diet lacking certain micronutrients, and the anxiety and psychological stress of lives lived within a demanding imperial administrative system that required a great deal from its subjects in the form of labor, taxes, and military service. The most skilled Egyptian physicians appear to have been aware of the multi-causal nature of headache, offering different remedies for different types of head pain, and showing in their prescriptions something of the diagnostic nuance that modern headache specialists bring to their practice. The treatment of headache associated with eye strain is separately described in the Egyptian texts, which is significant because it indicates that the Egyptians had observed the connection between visual stress and head pain. Their eye preparations for headache included caleria, mixtures applied directly to the eye as drops or washes, containing various substances including galena, the mineral lead sulfide that was the base of Egyptian kohl, the eye cosmetic that is so distinctive in Egyptian portraiture, and that actually had genuine antimicrobial properties that protected the eyes from the infections common in a dusty, bright light environment. The kohl that framed every Egyptian eye in the art was not purely aesthetic. It was protective. The galena in kohl inhibited bacterial growth in the tear duct and eye surface and reduced the glare of the intense Egyptian sun in a way similar to the black paint that modern athletes apply under their eyes for the same purpose. The same preparation that protected the eyes also appeared in medical formulations for eye strain headache, connecting cosmetic practice and medical practice in the typical Egyptian integration of all aspects of life. Let us now cross the Nile to the eastern bank and enter the great temple complex, because the temple in ancient Egypt was not only a religious institution, it was also, in many respects, a hospital, a pharmacy, a library, and a medical school all combined. The Piarank, which translates as the House of Life, was a scriptorium and library attached to major temples where medical texts were kept, copied, and studied, and where medical training was conducted. This institution, the House of Life, was one of the most important in Egyptian civilization and one of the ways in which medical knowledge was maintained and transmitted across the enormous span of Egyptian history. The medical papyri we have discussed were almost certainly produced and preserved in the houses of life of the major temples, and the physicians who trained there had access to a cumulative body of medical knowledge that had been building and being refined for centuries. The temple pharmacy was stocked with the botanical and mineral materials needed for the prescriptions in the medical texts, and the temple gardens grew medicinal plants specifically for pharmaceutical use. The garden of the Karnak temple complex in Thebes, for instance, had plantings that appear to have been specifically designed around medical use, including moringa trees whose oil appeared repeatedly in the medical prescriptions, Persea trees, mandrake plants whose strong sedative and analgesic properties were known and used. The Egyptian word for the mandrake was sometimes translated as something like the plant that opens the eyes of the dead, referring to its powerful effects on consciousness. And numerous herbs, including coriander, fenugreek, and cumin, that appeared in medical formulations. Fenugreek deserves specific mention because it was one of the most widely used medicinal plants in ancient Egypt and its properties are genuinely interesting. The Ebers Papyrus lists fenugreek in several headache and fever formulations. Fenugreek seeds contain compounds including trigonelline and 4-hydroxyisoleucine that have demonstrated anti-inflammatory and antipyretic properties in modern research, meaning they genuinely reduce fever. They also contain significant amounts of iron, which would have been valuable for a population where iron deficiency anemia was probably common, and where anemia-related headache was therefore a genuine clinical presentation. The Egyptian use of fenugreek in headache treatment may have been hitting several targets simultaneously without the healers knowing in modern biochemical terms why it worked. Cumin. Another ubiquitous herb in Egyptian medicine and cuisine has been shown in modern research to have analgesic properties mediated through opiate-like pathways, which is extraordinary to consider. The seeds that Egyptian mothers put in the water for a feverish child or in a headache preparation for an adult were doing something real, something that we can now describe at the molecular level that the Egyptians themselves could only have described as the cumin helps with the pain. The translation between ancient empirical observation and modern mechanistic understanding is one of the most fascinating intellectual bridges in all of medical history, and ancient Egyptian medicine is particularly rich in these bridges because the Egyptians left such detailed written records, and because modern researchers have now had several decades to subject their prescriptions to systematic pharmacological analysis. The analysis has been consistently validating. A study of the plant materials mentioned in the Ebers Papyrus found that a significant majority of the plants listed had demonstrable pharmacological activity corresponding to the conditions they were prescribed for. This was not always the case with all ancient medical traditions, where the pharmacological record was more mixed. Egyptian medicine, for all its integration of magical and religious elements, appears to have had a genuinely empirical core that selected for botanical materials that actually worked and discarded those that did not over the long course of its development. The night preparations for fever management in ancient Egyptian medicine are particularly interesting to consider for a nighttime audience, because they reflect a sophisticated understanding of the different phases of fever and the different ways that healing could be supported as day gave way to night. The Egyptians observed that fever often worsened in the late afternoon and evening, and that the night was a time of particular vulnerability for the feverish person, both practically because the attendant might need to sleep and the patient would be alone, and spiritually because the night was the time when hostile forces were most active and the protection of the divine most necessary. The nighttime preparations for a feverish patient therefore combined physical treatment with enhanced spiritual protection. The patient's sleeping area would be made as comfortable as possible, which in Egyptian terms meant well ventilated but sheltered from drafts, since Egyptian medical theory regarded certain winds as carrying illness and directing them away from the sick was considered important. The bed would be positioned according to the instructions of the healer, who might specify the direction of the patient's head in relation to the compass points based on the astrological and religious significance of those directions. The eastern direction, associated with the rising of Ra and therefore with life and renewal, was generally favorable for the sick. The western direction, associated with the setting sun and the land of the dead, was generally unfavorable. Protective amulets were placed around the bed at night, including figures of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of protection who stood guard over the most vulnerable moments of human life, childbirth, illness, and the transitions of the life cycle. Taweret figurines found in domestic contexts throughout Egyptian history speak to her importance in ordinary households as opposed to grand temple contexts. She was the goddess of the ordinary home, the one you put by the bed when something frightening was happening. The Bes amulets were placed similarly, Bes being the dwarf lion-headed deity who protected the household against the demons of the night, and who appears on headboards, on bedroom walls, on protective plaques designed specifically for the sleeping chamber. The presence of Bes in the room was not metaphorical reassurance. It was understood as the actual presence of a divine protective force that would keep hostile entities from approaching the sleeping, feverish, vulnerable person through the night. Alongside the amulets, a small oil lamp would often be kept burning through the night for a feverish patient, not only for practical purposes of checking on the patient, but also because light was protective in Egyptian thinking, the realm of Ra and of life, while darkness was the territory of certain hostile forces that withdrew in the presence of the divine light. The lamp's oil might be scented with fragrant plant materials, kyphi among them. Kyphi, the sacred incense compound of ancient Egypt, was one of the most complex and carefully prescribed pharmaceutical preparations in the entire Egyptian medical corpus, and it deserves extended discussion because it was used both as temple incense and as medicine, and the boundary between these uses was deliberately permeable. Kyphi was a compound preparation, a blend of many ingredients combined in specific proportions according to recipes that varied somewhat across different periods and temples, but shared a common core. The ingredients documented in the most complete recipes include honey, raisins, wine, frankincense, myrrh, juniper berries, cinnamon, camel grass, flag root, peppermint, and several other plants and resins. The preparation process was elaborate and ritualized, involving specific times and procedures, and the resulting compound was both burned as incense and administered medicinally, particularly for respiratory conditions and for fever management. Modern analysis of kyphi has found that its constituent materials include compounds with documented antibacterial, antifungal, anti-inflammatory, and sedative properties. Myrrh, one of its primary components, contains terpenoids that have genuine antimicrobial activity and that have been shown to inhibit the growth of pathogens, including some that cause respiratory infections, which were common in Egypt's dusty environment. Frankincense contains benzoic acids that are the subject of current research into anti-inflammatory compounds. The cinnamon in kyphi contains cinnamaldehyde, a potent antimicrobial compound. The combination of these materials in a single compound preparation, burned in the enclosed space of a sick room, was creating a genuine pharmaceutical aerosol whose components had real effects on the environment and on the respiratory systems of those breathing it. The Egyptians burned kyphi in temples to please the gods and in sick rooms to heal the sick, and the fact that these two uses overlapped was not accidental. The smoke that pleased the divine also healed the human, because the divine and the human were not separate categories, but were aspects of a single continuous world. Let us think now about the physicians themselves, the SWNW, the people who received formal training in the House of Life, and who practiced Egyptian medicine at its most sophisticated level. They were a diverse group across the vast span of Egyptian history, ranging from the famous Imhotep of the Old Kingdom, who was a physician, an architect, and engineer, and eventually a deified healing god in his own right, to the court physicians of the New Kingdom pharaohs, to the village physician who served a small agricultural community along the Nile. They operated within a professional tradition that had formal hierarchies, with chief physicians above physicians and physicians above their assistants, and specialty practices that included dentistry, which was specifically recognized as a separate medical specialty very early in Egyptian history, and ophthalmology, which was also distinct, and what appears to have been a form of internal medicine that dealt with the systemic conditions, including fever. The physician's examination of a patient with headache or fever was not casual. The Egyptian medical texts specify examination procedures that include observation of the patient's appearance, skin color, posture, and behavior, palpation of various body parts to assess temperature and tenderness, observation of the pulse, which Egyptian physicians monitored from multiple sites including the wrist and the temples and the neck, and assessment of the patient's urine and stool when relevant to the diagnosis. The diagnostic language of the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus follows a consistent format. This is a patient who has such and such condition. You will find such and such signs upon examination. This is a condition I will treat, or this is a condition I will contend with, or this is a condition that cannot be treated. This last category, the conditions that the physician recognized as beyond their power to help, was distinguished honestly and without evasion in the texts, which is one of the most remarkable aspects of Egyptian medicine. The honest acknowledgement of the limits of medical power, the willingness to say this cannot be cured, is a form of intellectual integrity that was not universal in the ancient world and that appears in the Egyptian texts with a directness that is both surprising and admirable. The physician's bag was literally a bag made of leather or linen, containing the tools of the examination and the most commonly needed medical materials: stone instruments for certain procedures, linen for bandaging, pre-prepared compounds in small ceramic vessels sealed with wax or linen cloth, dried plant materials, an amulet or two, a small scroll or wax tablet for notes on the patient. The Egyptian physician moving through a town or a village with their bag was as recognizable a figure as the saddlebag-carrying country doctors of 19th century rural America, and they served a similar function as the general practitioner of their community, the person who dealt with everything from the fever of a child to the headache of a woman to the infected wound of a laborer to the difficult birth of a first-time mother. The patients they served had their own role in the healing process, one that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate again. The Egyptian patient was expected to be an active participant in their own healing, not a passive recipient of treatment. They were expected to cooperate with the prescribed regimen, to wear the amulets correctly, to take the medicines as directed, to rest when directed to rest, and to avoid the foods and activities the physician identified as harmful to their condition. They were also expected to maintain the correct mental and spiritual orientation, which in Egyptian terms meant aligning themselves with the divine order, performing the appropriate prayers and offerings, and maintaining the attitude of trust and openness that allowed the healing forces to work through them. A patient who resisted or disbelieved or continued the behaviors that had contributed to their illness was, in Egyptian medical thinking, actively impeding their own recovery. This understanding of the patient's role in healing aligns, again, with what modern medicine is learning about the role of patient psychology in treatment outcomes. Patients who are more engaged in their own care, who trust their treatment, who maintain a positive orientation, do statistically better in numerous outcome measures. The mechanism is partly behavioral, partly the measurable neurological effects of expectation and hope on the body's own pain and immune systems. The ancient Egyptians built this understanding into the fabric of their healing practice, not because they understood the mechanism, but because they had observed the pattern, and they were, as we have repeatedly seen, careful observers. The Egyptian night, for the person managing headache or fever, was structured differently than the night for a healthy person. The normal Egyptian sleep pattern in the summer months, when the heat was most severe, involved sleeping on the roof of the flat-roofed houses in the early part of the night to take advantage of whatever cooling breezes the Nile offered, and moving inside or staying inside when the dew began to fall before dawn, since dew was associated with illness in Egyptian thinking and avoiding exposure to it was standard health advice. For the sick person, this rooftop sleep might not be possible, and the indoor arrangement required careful management of ventilation and temperature. The bed of the sick person might be elevated slightly, because the Egyptians observed correctly that elevation of the head helped with certain types of head pain and with the respiratory congestion that sometimes accompanied fever. Egyptian beds were not always flat platform beds. Some had an inclined sleeping surface, and some records suggest that elevated head positions were specifically prescribed for certain conditions. The headrest, which appears throughout Egyptian art and in the material culture record as a distinctive curved support placed under the neck rather than the head, was not simply a pillow substitute. It was a specific orientation tool that kept the head cool by allowing air to circulate beneath it, and that maintained the neck in a position that Egyptian experience had found beneficial for headache conditions, keeping the cervical spine in alignment in a way that reduced tension headache components. The headrest in Egyptian culture also had a protective spiritual dimension. The curved form of the headrest was associated with the horizon, the Akhit hieroglyph, which depicted the sun rising or setting between two hills, the most significant cosmological symbol of renewal and transition. Sleeping with one's head on a headrest was therefore sleeping in symbolic alignment with the moment of renewal, the horizon moment when Ra emerged each morning to give life to the world. For a sick person, sleeping with their head on an inscribed protective headrest was participating in this renewal symbolically and asking to be aligned with the life-giving power of the solar cycle. Headrests inscribed with protective spells and divine images have been found in the tombs of Egyptians of every social level, suggesting their universal importance in the sleep and healing contexts. We should also speak about the ancient Egyptian understanding of what we might call the psychology of illness, because the Egyptians were not naive about the emotional and mental dimensions of physical suffering. The Ebers Papyrus includes a section that some scholars have described as the oldest known writing about depression and anxiety, describing conditions of the heart and mind that overlap considerably with what modern medicine would classify as mood disorders, and expressing them with a specificity of observation that suggests the Egyptians had paid careful attention to the psychological state of their patients over many generations. The relationship between emotional distress and physical illness, including headache and fever in certain presentations, was understood by Egyptian physicians in terms that, translated into modern language, would not be entirely unfamiliar to a modern psychosomatic medicine practitioner. The remedy for the emotional components of illness included not only the physical preparations and the ritual interventions, but also what we might call supportive conversation. The physician or healer who sat with the patient, asked about their condition, listened to their account of the illness's history and its effects, and offered the reassurance of expert attention and genuine care, was providing something that had real therapeutic value. The Ebers Papyrus includes instructions to the physician that include speaking certain words to the patient, phrases of reassurance and encouragement that were themselves considered part of the treatment, not merely its polite wrapping. The healing word was a form of Heka, the magical force of properly spoken language, and the healer who spoke it well was channeling a genuine power. As the evening comes on in Thebes, as the sun descends below the horizon of the western desert in the spectacular orange and violet display that the dry Egyptian air makes possible, Nefertari's headache has moved from the acute phase into the post-headache fatigue that most migraine sufferers recognize, the drained, slightly fragile, not quite right feeling that follows the storm. She is no longer in pain, but she is not yet herself. Hinut has gone home, leaving behind a cup of cooled, herbed water for the night and a small bundle of dried herbs to add to the morning drink, and an amulet, a simple jade pillar carved from blue faience that she has placed near the bed with a few words of blessing. Nefertari's husband, the scribe Amenhotep, has come home from the temple offices and brought with him a small gift that he thought might help, a portion of fresh pomegranate from the temple garden, because the juice of pomegranate was considered cooling and restorative, and he had overheard one of the temple physicians mentioning it in a context of recovery from fever and head complaints. The pomegranate contains polyphenols with genuine anti-inflammatory properties that modern research has confirmed. But what matters most right now is simply that he thought of it, that he carried it home for her, that he is sitting beside the bed in the dimming light of the evening and has not asked her to explain how she is feeling or when she will be better. The moment of sitting with the sick person in the evening quiet, doing nothing in particular, requiring nothing of the recovering body, is itself a form of medicine. The ancient Egyptians knew this. Every healing tradition across every culture and every period of history has known this, though each has described it differently. The presence of the caring other, the warmth of being attended to without demand. The knowledge that you do not have to manage your illness alone, but that someone is with you in it. These things heal in ways that no biochemical mechanism explains completely, but that the body receives and responds to with measurable gratitude. The stars are coming out over Thebes now. The western sky, where Ra has descended, still holds a faint wash of deep rose along the horizon line where the desert meets the sky. The eastern sky is already deep blue-violet, and the first stars are appearing with the particular brilliance that the clear, dry Egyptian air allows. The Nile sounds different at night, its movement audible in the quiet in a way that it is not during the day when all the human sounds of the city cover it. Nefertari hears it through the window of her room, that ancient sound of the river moving, and something in her body relaxes further at the sound, because the river was not merely the practical fact of Egyptian life. It was the divine fact, the Nile as Hapi, the inundation god, the Nile as the source of all life, the Nile as the presence of the divine in the most daily and undeniable physical form, the water that had fed every Egyptian who ever lived and would feed every Egyptian who would ever live. To feel the headache beginning to truly recede on the evening after a hard day's pain, to lie in a cooled room with the river audible and the stars coming out and a caring hand nearby, is a form of peace that does not require translation from ancient times to modern ones. It is one of the most recognizable human experiences there is. And the ancient Egyptians knew how to work toward it with everything they had, every herb and every spell and every diagnostic skill and every divine invocation, all directed toward this simple, beautiful outcome. The body resting in the evening quiet, the pain gone or going, the river moving outside, the stars appearing above the flat roof where the family will sleep again tonight, and the knowledge that tomorrow the Nile will rise or fall according to its divine schedule. The sun will cross the sky as it always has, and another day will begin in the oldest civilization the world had ever seen. Now, as we draw our long evening toward its close, let us carry forward what the ancient Egyptians have given us across these thousands of years. They gave us the knowledge that pain deserves systematic, respectful attention. They gave us the practice of combining the physical and the spiritual in healing, the understanding that the person in pain is more than a body with a malfunctioning system and deserves treatment of their whole experience. They gave us the willow bark that became aspirin. They gave us the honey that we now know is genuinely antimicrobial. They gave us the artemisia preparation that pointed toward the most important antimalarial compounds in the modern world. They gave us the insight that patient psychology is part of the healing equation. They gave us the observation that cooling the extremities reduces fever, and that elevated head position helps headache, and that blue lotus has calming properties, and that the presence of a caring person in the sick room is not merely comfort, but medicine. They also gave us something harder to quantify, but equally important: the model of a civilization that took ordinary human suffering seriously. The pain of a headache, the heat of a fever, was not beneath the attention of Egypt's greatest medical minds, was not excluded from the medical texts that the most learned scribes preserved in the houses of life of the greatest temples of the ancient world. ordinary suffering mattered. The ordinary body, the body of the craftsman's wife in the Theban neighborhood with the pounding head and the light sensitivity, deserved the full attention of everything Egyptian medicine knew, from the willow bark to the spell to the presence of the caring neighbor with the basket of herbs. You are lying down now, in the dark, in whatever room is yours tonight. And somewhere beneath you, if you go back far enough through the layers of time, there is the Nile. There is always the Nile, the original great river, the source of everything that grew in that extraordinary valley and everything that came from it to the world. The healers of ancient Egypt dealt with pain and fever and the vulnerability of the suffering body with more skill and care and wisdom than we generally give them credit for. They did not have aspirin by that name, but they had willow bark. They did not have ibuprofen. But they had moringa and fenugreek and cumin and the anti-inflammatory compounds of the blue lotus. They did not have antimalarial drugs, but they had artemisia. And they had something that nothing in the modern pharmacopoeia fully replaces: the understanding that healing is a sacred act, that the suffering person is held within a divine order that cares about their pain, that the words spoken over the sick bed carry power, and that the gentle hands of the healer and the herbs in the basket and the lamp burning through the night are all expressions of the same force, the force that wants the suffering to end and the body to rest and the morning to come again. Let that force be with you now. Let the ancient river carry you. Let the stars above Thebes look down through 5,000 years and find you resting. The headache is someone else's tonight. The fever broke yesterday. You are simply lying down in the dark with the whole long, extraordinary story of human healing behind you, and ahead of you the sweet, undifferentiated dark of sleep. Rest now. The physicians of ancient Egypt have done their work.